okay? So a muscle contraction that is produced as a result of a single action potential is what we call a twitch. And to sort of describe that more loosely, it's basically a single period of muscle contraction, or a single, quick, brief period of muscle contraction in response to an action potential. Now, don't forget that an end plate potential is an action potential, okay? Don't let that terminology confuse you. An end plate potential is an action potential on muscle. It's a terminology specific to muscle. But you should remember what an action potential is, right? That's stuff from Unit 1. So in response to one action potential that arrives on a motor neuron to a motor end plate exciting skeletal muscle, we get a brief period of contraction, and that is called a twitch, okay? Now, it's an all or nothing event on a muscle, and we can describe this in different ways. A twitch can be at the level of the myofibril. It can be at the level of the muscle fiber. It can be at the level of the entire muscle unit. And we talked about how the level of contraction is really down at the sarcomere. We talked about how the sarcomere shortens. That brings about myofibril shortening. That brings about muscle cell shortening or muscle fiber shortening. And then the entire muscle contracts, like the fascicles and so on. So a twitch can be defined for a fiber, it can be defined for a motor unit, or it can be defined for an entire muscle, okay? Let's speak about the phases of a twitch. So there are 3 phases of a twitch. And again, we're describing what happens on muscle in response to an action potential or an end plate potential. So we have a latent period. This is that beginning of muscle contraction where we're not generating any force, okay? And now force is a terminology that we use to express the ability of a muscle contraction to do work, okay? I'll say that again. Force is the terminology we use, force or tension, to express the ability of a muscle contraction to do work. Muscles don't contract idly, okay? They only contract to do work, to lift loads. You're lifting a bag, you're lifting a book. This is a load, right? This is work, this is tension, this is force. So there are 3 phases of this event, and at the beginning of this, there is no force being generated, okay? We call this the latent period, and this is the time that it takes for that machinery to get warmed up, for the end plate potential to travel through the T-tubules, for those receptors to open up, for calcium to leave the SR, to get into the cytoplasm. All of that takes time, right? That actin, myosin sliding past each other, that takes time to warm up. So for this brief period, there is a stimulus, but there's no force or tension being generated. The contraction phase of this is where we do have force generated, and now we are actually generating some contraction on the muscle. So the muscle is actively shortening, which is what is giving us that tension, that ability to do work or lift the load. And then the final phase here is the latent phase, is the relaxation phase. This is the longest phase of the twitch. And this is essentially where our force generation drops off because we've overcome the load, whatever the load was. We no longer need to generate any additional force, and the muscle goes back to its relaxed state. This is where calcium is being reuptaken or pumped back into the SR, okay? And it's leaving those actin molecules, and so the tropomyosin is covering those binding sites again. Okay, so this is all tied to cross-bridge cycling. Okay, so make sure you're connecting cross-bridge cycling to the events here. Let's draw this out a little bit closer. Let's draw this out a little bit closer. Okay, so we got the phases of a twitch. Any questions so far? And so what we're comparing here, looking at these phases, is the amount of force generated in grams. Now you're thinking about the weight of that load. So how much tension or force is being contributed onto that load to help move it. Then we're going to look at time here in milliseconds. And so what we mentioned is a stimulus. Now, this is nothing but an action potential. Okay, a stimulus, i.e. an action potential that arrives on this muscle. And that is stimulating muscle contraction. But for a brief period, I'll draw this in green, we start at 0, and for a brief period, there is no force being generated here. Okay, no force being generated. Then the muscle contracts rapidly, and then it takes a while to fully relax, right? This is a much longer phase than contraction. Alrighty, so we have that latent period, which is that brief period where there's no muscle contraction or no muscle tension. We have our very short contraction phase. And then we have our long latent period or latent phase. Not latent, I'm sorry. Relaxation. Okay, relaxation. So latent, contraction, and relaxation. So let's just describe loosely here what's happening in each of these phases. So we know that the latent period or the latent phase there is no tension generated here, right? No tension or no force. And this is because there is no cross-bridge cycling, no cross bridges. Okay, and this is basically a lag time that allows those events, that allows the time for the events that I mentioned earlier to take place. Calcium has to get into the cytoplasm from the SR, it has to get to actin, it has to uncover the binding sites, and that takes time. Okay, so this is lag time to allow for cross-bridge cycling. I'm sorry, not cross-bridge cycling. For excitation, contraction, coupling. Okay, basically allowing calcium to get into the cytoplasm to do its thing. And that takes time. The second phase here is the contraction phase. And here we're actually generating tension or force. So the tension or force rises. And this is because we have cross bridging. So let me just clarify this here. It's important to understand the sequence of these events. Excitation, contraction, coupling has to happen before cross-bridge cycling. Excitation, contraction, coupling is the movement of calcium, right? The regulation of calcium on actin. And so that needs to precede the cross-bridge cycle steps, right? The power stroke and all of that. So now we have excitation, contraction, coupling completed. What we have here is active cross-bridge cycling happening, which is that sliding of actin and myosin, and that is how we get our force or tension generation, okay? And so this leads to the peak of contraction, where the muscle is able to generate as much load as it can. This can be anywhere from 10 to 100 milliseconds, depending on the size of the muscle, the type of muscle, the size of the motor unit, all of that stuff, which we'll talk about later on. And then the final phase here is the relaxation phase. Okay, this is where calcium is leaving the cytoplasm. First off, this is the longest phase. Okay, the longest phase, and that's because this takes the most time. We have active pumping of calcium back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. We have our tension slowly decreasing. And we have calcium pumps that are basically moving that calcium from the cytoplasm back into the SR. So calcium leaves the cytoplasm. Okay. Okay. So basically, these are 3 phases of a twitch. And remember, just to define a twitch one more time, that's that brief period of muscle contraction, which starts with no force being generated. We quickly generate some force by shortening or contracting that muscle briefly, and then we slowly relax that muscle, which is mainly due to calcium leaving the cytoplasm, going back into the SR, moving off of those actin molecules, and tropomyosin covering up those binding sites again, okay? Make sure you're connecting those cross-bridge events with the phases of a